with us today. We're very, very glad you're here. We have a tradition that we always do. We always pray for another church in town because that's part of our DNA. That's a huge thing that we believe, that we're not the church. We're just a piece of a big, giant church of people trying to follow after Jesus. So today we're going to pray for the Church of the Resurrection and my friend Bob Norton over there, that's the pastor. So if you're the praying type, join me. We'll pray for them. Father, we come to you today and we thank you for this beautiful Sunday and the place that we live, and we're thankful. God, we're thankful for the joy and the grace that you give us, Lord. We thank you for the wonderful community here in Flagstaff, so diverse and different of people trying hard to follow after you, Jesus. And today we thank you for our family that meets at Church of the Resurrection, God. Thanks for Bob and his leadership, God. Thank you for just everyone that's over there. And I pray that you will always draw us closer to them and all of us closer to you, and let us shine your light together in this town. We also pray today as we open your word that you will make it living and active and teach us. We love you and give you this time. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, when we first started the Commons, we were meeting in our house, just a group of adults, a few years ago. And one of the discussions that came up would be, would we meet on Sunday morning like regular churches, or should we try Sunday night? And I was actually in favor of Sunday morning against the leadership of the whole team, and I ultimately got won over. But the reason was we wanted to create a place, especially for Flagstaff people, because we all know in Flagstaff we like to do stuff on the weekends. We enjoy going out and skiing and camping on Saturday night and those kind of things. Ultimately, I think it was the right decision until the NFL playoffs get here. And I just want you to know that days like today make me question my calling severely. And the only reason I'm even standing in front of you right now is because it's halftime in the Packers-49ers game. That's it. And so I'm going to be very brief so we can get out of here and watch the rest of that. No, that's not true. I think it's probably past halftime or close to that. But yesterday there was great games. I was in the middle of writing a paper. In fact, I holed myself into the Commons office for the last 2 days, writing a paper, my last paper of my first module at St. Andrews. And I want you to know what it's about because I think it's going to move you. It was on the contribution of Francis X. Clooney in the post-colonial sense of a contrapuntal reading of Vedanta Desika, his interpretation of Jayanta Bhutta's Mimamsa, scriptures of the Veda, juxtaposed against Karl Barth and his look at incarnation versus embodiment. So what I thought about was just reading that paper to you today. And the only reason I shared that with you is whatever garbage comes out of my mouth the rest of this time, at least you can walk away saying, thank God you didn't read that paper. My brain almost exploded. I just want you to know that was not easy for me. I was in the office, I didn't eat normal meals, and I was kind of going crazy. And I just want you to know there is the possibility that I will start to twitch or fall down and spurt out Sanskrit phrases. And if that happens, just drag me off and sing some more songs or something like that, and we'll move on. I'm really excited, though. I get to go to Scotland again on Wednesday, and I want you to know that when I'm gone, I'm only going to miss one Sunday. I'll be gone for 10 days over there in my own personal Hogwarts. But just want you to know that Jason Rennie is going to be here next weekend sharing with you guys. I know you guys will be excited, so pack it out and hear what he has, because I think it's going to be a gift to everybody. Now, today, as some of you might know, if you've been tracking with us, is a holiday in the church season. It's specifically Epiphany, everyone's favorite holiday, right? You look forward all year and fast and wait for Epiphany. Well, I like Epiphany. We're going to talk about it a little bit. And this is the end of the Christmas season. Last Sunday, I put forth to you the good news that Christmas isn't over, because 2,000 years of Christian history, actually probably more accurately about 1,700 years of kind of unified Christian history, is that Christmas Day is the beginning of the 12 days of Christmas. And today is the 12th day since Christmas. You got to go back and do the math to see that I'm right on that. But we're entering into the 12th night, the concept that Shakespeare wrote his great comedy play, The 12th Night, about. In fact, Johann Sebastian Bach wrote several very famous symphonies basically to celebrate on the 12th night, that the last part of the celebration of the Nativity of Christ. And the night before Epiphany, now there's this weird thing in the church of deciding when Epiphany is, if it's the Sunday like today, or if it's tomorrow, the January 6th, it just depends on how it falls every year. But Epiphany is a valuable thing, and we're going to talk briefly about it. We're also going to join with the Church Universal in looking at what about 1.2 billion Christians around the world are looking at today. That's kind of one of the neat things about liturgical traditions that have a calendar and follow through, is they're kind of looking at the same scriptures at the same time. Now, Epiphany, the word Epiphany, actually just means shining forth. It comes from this Greek word epiphaneia, and it just means light shining forth. Some of the ancient Greek philosophers and writers, when they wrote in Greek, and they used this word epiphaneia, they used it in reference to one specific common human event, the breaking of the dawn. There was this moment that the philosophers like to think about, the darkness of night, and every single morning the dawn would come again. And there's that little moment, almost like when you watch the sunset for that last moment. The same thing happens in the morning when the light pierces the horizon and you have Epiphany. And that's kind of what in English an epiphany is, a light coming on for you. And the idea is theologically, in fact, some churches and traditions like the Orthodox Church change the term to theophany, a God shining forth, God coming forth. In fact, this is also why we named our youngest son Blaze Estes Macaulay. Estes is an old English word for east, and blaze means blaze. So it's like a light in the east, or the breaking of the dawn. It's epiphany, and it's really, really cool and nerdy, and that's what we did. But here's what the church looks at together on this day. There's several different stories that the church looks at, and it all has to do with the idea of God's revealing himself and his glory. Specifically in the incarnation, the idea that God put flesh on, that he showed up, light entered into darkness. The Epiphany is the breaking of the dawn. It's a very fitting ending to the Christmas season. And so, because of that, the most famous story that people look at is the story of the Magi who come and visit. We already looked in depth at that group of people, those scholars, those astrologers that came to Jesus. And the reason the church did that historically is because they think it's really great from the very beginning that it wasn't just Jewish good news, that there were Gentile, non-Jewish people who followed a light and found out that light had entered into the world. And then there's two other stories that churches look at on this day: the baptism of Jesus and the wedding of Cana and Jesus turning water into wine, which is what we're going to look at today. Now, before we dive into that story from John chapter 2, and I thought it would be fitting that we chose that one of the kind of liturgical scriptures that the world is looking at on this weekend, I thought it would be a good idea to tell some stories about weddings. And so I have a lot of those, and most of you do, because weddings are events where things happen. And over the years here, I've shared a few of these stories. One of my personal favorites was, because the thing about an American wedding is it's kind of an event. And we're going to look at a Jewish wedding, which is a really big deal. And at a Jewish wedding, you have a week-long party. It's a celebration. And we think in America, or in our culture, that we have a one-day event. But any of you that's ever been married knows that it's not a one-day event. You have the big rehearsal dinner, and it's just a big deal with families coming in. And at one particular rehearsal dinner that I went to, one of my best friend's weddings, I think I shared this story about 3 years ago. It's one of my favorites, though. We were giving toasts to our best friend, and each guy was coming up and sharing about our friend Chris, the great things about him. But one of our friends had a video of all of us when we were on a road trip where we had videoed ourselves, before any of us were dating anyone, speaking to our future wives. It was really cool because we were on this man trip. We were all loser single people at the time. Actually, that's a terrible thing to say. If you're single, you're not a loser. You're an incredible gift. Well, I'm going to get some hate mail over that one. I meant we were losers. You're not. I'm just digging the ball. Anyway, so we're on this road trip and having a good time. We were at Natural Bridges Park, and we were sliding around. We're just a bunch of guys sliding around in our underwear on ice and all this stuff. And one of us had the idea that we would video these messages to our future wives. So, I mean, that's romantic, right, ladies? Yeah, no? Okay. We thought it was. So we took these videos, each of us took turns, and we said, hey, I just want you to know, I haven't met you yet, but I'm praying for you and can't wait to meet you. Super sappy, cheesy stuff. Well, anyway, one of our friends had kept that video and was going to show the video of Chris at his toast with everybody there in the family's talking to his future wife. Great idea. So he gets it all set up, they get the stuff going, and all of a sudden you see Chris on the screen, and his mouth's just moving, and nothing's happening. It's just like, there's no sound. It's like technical difficulties. And so they're really struggling and don't know what to say, and so that he doesn't know what to say, because that was his whole plan for his toast, and he's going, And so he says, okay, well, I just want you to know that I think you're great. And all of a sudden the technology guy's like, no, I think I got it to work. And then he shows it up there again, the same thing, it's just the voice moving, nothing. I mean, there's no voice, it's just the mouth moving. So he's really panicking, it's getting really awkward, because everyone's like, okay, obviously the technology's not gonna work. Third time, same thing. Finally, he gives up, he's like, forget the video, and he starts talking. The video guy's, no, I got it, it's ready. He says, okay, show it. He pushes play, and it's me in my underwear, sliding across and screaming on the slide. It's like, sliding on the stomach, woo! And every bridesmaid instantly turned and looked at me, and I'm like, I don't know how that happened. That was a huge train. I was thinking another wedding. I was the Brian Tinder, who many of you know, in his wedding, I was one of two best men, and we were standing in the line, and we're supposed to give the ring to the groom at the right moment, and as the bride is walking down, Brian's standing there, he's about to cry like every sissy guy does. And instead of like this moment of holiness, his eyes get real big, and he turns and he goes, I don't have the ring. What? Somehow the ring got left in his car outside. So all of a sudden we became like a telephone line whispering like down the groomsmen, like, you gotta go out to the ring. And we sent it all the way down like tens of groomsmen. And the last guy, who obviously was probably barely even his friend, he said, the courtesy groomsman, he ran out and got the thing. It was really funny because we're standing up there at the front and the whole ceremony is going through and they get to the part of the ring, so we still don't have it. And I mean, it was like a movie scene. These guys were like ninjas, just passing this thing, sliding behind their back. And he says, do you have the ring? And it was like, and he said, yes, I do. We're like, yeah, that's how we roll. I think I've told you before at our wedding, we had these 2 doves that we didn't know about. Marcus' dad bought us these 2 doves to release as a symbol of our marriage. And then the wind knocked it over, and I opened the gate, and only 1 dove came out. And then I ended up like beating the cage with a unity candle to get the other one to come out about 10 minutes later. My point is, weddings don't go well. And the wedding we're going to look at today in John, we're going to look at a wedding in John that he tells us about that didn't go well. This is in John chapter 2, and I just want to give you a little bit of an idea that I like to point out when I talk about John specifically. John was the one whom Jesus loved. That's how he referred to himself. He reveals that at the end of his gospel. His whole identity was, this guy Jesus that I'm writing about, he loved me. And I think that's really cool. He was an old man when he wrote this. In fact, the Synoptic Gospels had all been written. And John was probably in Ephesus at the time, and a church had already, a Greek church had exploded there of non-Jewish people. And when he wrote his gospel, he was very aware that the people who were going to read his eyewitness account, decades after the life of Jesus, and John had gone on to become one of the greatest leaders of this inexplicably exploding church in the Mediterranean. He was one of the most important figures. He had great stories to tell. He lived through the complete destruction of Jerusalem, and he was exiled. At one point they tried to boil him in a pot of boiling oil. It didn't work. He was exiled to an island where he wrote this apocalyptic political literature of Revelation. Incredible life. And at the end, as an elder, living it all out, he writes these beautiful letters that we have in the New Testament canon. And he writes this gospel in a very unique way, knowing that he's writing to a Greek audience and a Jewish audience. And we'll see that as the story progresses. But he wanted to portray and let people know the things that he remembered about his best friend. And one of the first things he tells about in John chapter 2, after the great prologue, which we've been looking at through the Advent season, the idea of God becoming flesh, the divinity of Christ, he starts to tell about the human Jesus in John chapter 2. It says this: on the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Jewish wedding. 7-day party, big deal. Cana in Galilee is one of the few places, one of the great things I like about the historicity of these particular documents is how rooted they are in physical space. These things took place with real people, with real governments, in real locations. Cana of Galilee is one of very few places that we don't know exactly where it is. There's 2 possible. There's Ketef Cana and there's another Cana. And the traditional one, I've actually been there, and when I was in the Holy Lands a couple years ago, I rented a car and drove through there, and it's pretty sickening. You're about 4 miles east of Nazareth. I couldn't wait to get to Nazareth and see what that was like. But basically, it's just a bunch of stands of people trying to sell wine for $15 because Jesus did this miracle there, which I think is kind of cheesy. But the reality is most scholars believe the real Cana is about 10 miles north. In fact, 1998, they probably discovered the real Cana of Galilee. So this is close to his hometown. That's why there would be relationships, why that Jesus' friends would be there. And I do want to point this out because I think this is a big deal. Jesus' mother, which interestingly, John never calls her Mary as opposed to the other Gospels. He always calls her the mother of Jesus. I think he roots her identity in her relationship to even her son. And by the way, I think she's one of the heroes of this story. But she was invited to this wedding, but I love that Jesus and his friends were invited to this wedding. See, Jesus was the kind of guy that got invited to parties. And I think that's a really big deal. One of the things that I think is thematic in any time you should open your mouth and talk about Jesus is you must talk about the fact that he was arguably one of the most attractive human beings, personality-wise, that ever lived. He was polarizing, certainly. People wanted to kill him, love him, but people were drawn to him. And they were drawn to him in a positive sense of saying, hey, Mary seemed to be the one with the relationships here. They're like, hey, why don't you invite your son Jesus, this rabbi who started to gather followings. And by the way, there's been no miracles. He's just an educational rabbi at this point, by the way, highly educated in the Jewish system. And he's pulled together this ragtag group of followers, and now people think, but whatever it was, they liked these guys. They said, why don't you bring your son Jesus and his friends? They were invited to the party. It says, when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. There's a couple interesting pieces in this sentence. First of all, some commentators have pointed out in first century Palestine, there's actually a legal issue at play here. This is foreign to our Western minds, but there was this concept of reciprocity. I don't know how you say that word. You know, where you're like exchanging stuff? I don't know what that word is. But the reality is, back in first century Palestine, you could be legally sued if you brought a bad wedding gift to a wedding. I think we should incorporate that here. I think that'd be really sweet. But also, if you didn't have enough wine, you could be legally sued. So this is kind of a big deal when the wine runs out. But here's kind of a neat little John Greek hidden jewel in this text. You know, in the NIV, which we're reading here on the screen, it says, when the wine was gone. And it's kind of interesting. The word kai in Greek means and. It says, and the wine was gone. And it's interesting because there are so many Greek conjunctions like but or then or something that would say contrary to what you would expect, but it's almost like John is saying, and the wine ran out, because that's what happens at weddings. And it's almost like we have in the Greek, John as an old man making a comment about the nature of weddings and perhaps even marriage. In fact, some of the ancient commentators, we can go back to the first and second century people who would write their thoughts about this story. And one of the things that they find most intriguing about John's selection of beginning the signs of Jesus with this is that he chose a wedding. That he chose a thing that honored marriage. In fact, John 1, this great prologue, is about creation and Jesus' role in that as a creator God. And then just like Genesis, the second story of creation in Genesis 2, we have marriage as the central thing. And it's almost like John is saying, the wine is going to run out at a wedding. The wine is also going to run out at a marriage. We need to understand a little bit of ancient culture. Wine always represented joy and exuberance. So I think it's kind of cool. This is not what my message is about today, but for you, those of you that are married, I think it's kind of neat that I think John was actually subtly writing into his text here, the wine of your marriage will run out. It's going to happen. But Jesus can fix that. There is absolute hope that Jesus can change the nature of our marriages. Not at all the point of the thing, but I think it's kind of a cool side note. So then there's this crazy situation, and then there's this mysterious response by Jesus. Remember, she just said, there's no more wine. She just made a statement. In verse 4, the NIV says, woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my hour has not yet come. For most of my life, I found this perplexing. It seems like a rude Jesus. First thing we need to understand is the word woman in English is disrespectful. I would not address my parents that way. I would not address my wife like that. Woman, get over here and do that. That doesn't work out well. And that's kind of it's just lost in translation because the word in the Greek, gneia, has no negative connotation. In fact, it's the opposite of that. In fact, we see it used many times by John in John 4 with the Samaritan woman, and later at the end when he's talking to Mary again at the cross, and also to Mary Magdalene. And what we know about this word and its usage is it really means man. It's the utmost term of respect. And so that really helps a little bit with taking the sharp edge. It's still a mysterious response from Jesus, but he starts respectfully and he says, ma'am, what do you want from me? I think in the NIV where to say, why do you involve me? The Greek is this idiom. In fact, it's the same idiom, ironically, that the Synoptic Gospels use with the demons when they speak out to Jesus and they say, hey, Son of God, what do you want from me? It's the same Greek idiom. And it's ironic, I think, that John, having access to the Synoptics, uses it as Jesus' own words. He says, ma'am, what is it that you want of me? He says, my hour has not yet come. My hour is a very specific term. In John, it's listed many times. This is the first, and every other time is talking about his death and crucifixion. The climax, the centerpiece, the ultimate crescendo of this whole gospel is Jesus' hour, his passion, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the hope, the message, the good news that John's talking about. He's saying, my hour has not yet come here. I am not going to pretend that I have any idea what Jesus was saying to his mother in this point. Commentators throughout the centuries have disagreed and come up with creative things, and I think sometimes it's okay to just say, I don't know, there's some mystery here. He said something about that. But here's what I like. We do know what Mary did. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. I love this because in my mind, I almost see physically this interaction, this tension, because you have to remember, John is setting this whole thing up as a progression to say that this is the first sign of Jesus to his disciples of this miraculous power as creator God. In fact, Irenaeus, the very first commentator we have from the first century, said this is all about the divinity of Christ. But what we see here is this tension of this timing of when is it that God's going to show up in this problem. Because in life, wine runs out. We run into situations that are troublesome. And often the question is, God, when are you going to show up? And the question does become, whose timing are we relying on? And almost in this very human sense, I almost see Mary nudging in her mind her little boy, just kind of nudging him along, saying, okay, whatever, I'm just going to have some faith, something great's going to happen here. And I think about her raising this little boy and seeing the extraordinariness of the only her eyes would have seen, the idea of God squeezed into a human little boy that grows up. I almost see an image of like the Discovery Channel, a mother bird nudging her little bird to it's time, jump out of the tree and go do it. And ultimately we'll see that she was right. Also, Luther, when he comments on this, in the Reformation, says something interesting. He noticed that in the Greek, when it says do whatever he tells you, it's all present tense. And it's also something that John probably intended, writing to this Greek audience, to have a double meaning. And I think it's pretty obvious that we could almost hear Mary saying to us, do whatever he tells you. I know my boy. If you do what he tells you to, you're going to like what you see. You're going to see something extraordinary. So I think that's kind of a neat thought. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Now we have these physical details, and this is almost a place where we can start to see where he recognizes that he has to explain some Jewish things to his Greek audience, probably in Ephesus, as he's telling this story retroactively. The very first century commentators, they were obsessed with the number 6 because, see, this culture back then in Palestine liked this whole philosophical idea of numerology, and they believed that numbers had great significance. So these first century commentators, when they wrote about this, would say the 6 is always representing not quite God's number 7. Biblically, in the Old Testament, Jewish culture tells us that 7 was supposed to be a picture of completeness. It's probably why these ancient Jewish writers that talked about the creation event were using numbers like 7 to say that it was perfect, it was holy. And they're saying that this number 6 here means that the Jewish ritual, the religion, and by the way, this is the exact same custom that Jesus comes face to face with later on when the Pharisees weren't washing their hands, or he wasn't washing their hands and the Pharisees got onto them. He's saying it's not about religion, it's not about custom, these big stone jars with water that you're supposed to wash your hands ritually in. That's incomplete. Jesus is the 7, the fulfillment of that. I'm not real into the numerology stuff, but I do think there's a thick message of a fulfillment of the Jewish progression. That all of these things are fulfilled completely in Christ. This religious stuff, the washing of hands and all that, he's got a way better picture in mind. It says they're holding 20 to 30 gallons, and then Jesus says to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. I think that's almost a hint at their excitement. These are interesting servants. They're excited to see what's going to happen. And it said he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet, or the master of the ceremonies, or some translations say the head waiter. This seems to be like a catering service. This is interesting to me because the way John tells this story, the vast majority of it took place with the lowly servants that were in charge of serving this banquet, which I think is fitting to the shocking message of Jesus, the humility of God, that most of the people that saw the action were just the servants and not the bridegroom and the guests and all those kind of things. I also think it's interesting that nobody exhibits any great faith here. You know, one of the things I think we do incorrectly in church history is we try to overinterpret historical stories about who Jesus was and say, this story is about having great faith. You've got to fill yourself to the brim, or you have to completely sacrifice yourself. And I'd say, these guys didn't have any extraordinary faith. They just said, okay, I'll put some water in here. Let's see what happens. Here's what happened. They did so. And it says, the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. 4 Greek words that are very simple, sums up a miracle that took place. A giant amount of water had turned into wine. It says he didn't realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. By the way, in the Greek, that's emphatic. It's almost like John, when he writes it, laughs out loud. But the servants knew. They knew exactly where that water had come from. This guy had no idea. His reaction is central to understanding this. It says, then he called the bridegroom aside, who has no idea any of this is going on. It says, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best until now. Now, on a historical note, I'll make a couple notes here. The Greek actually says when everyone else is drunk. And I like that the NIV waters it down a little bit to had too much to drink. Because to the modern ears, especially if you're a member of the Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, or you've lost someone to this, or you know someone affected by alcoholism, I think it is important to understand that drunkenness is something the Bible is very clear hurts us and hurts other people and does not honor God or ourselves or bring any joy to anybody. So it's okay with me that they took that translation and made it, they had too much to drink. In fact, most translations change it into something of that sense. But if we get too careful, we miss the shocking exuberance that is the central message of this whole thing. The central message of this is that religion or rituals or all those things, all the attempts humans can make, don't hold a candle to the extraordinary exuberance that God has in mind for our lives. We're talking about 150 gallons of wine. That's a lot of wine. It is a huge party. There was probably a lot of people in this rural Cana for this event, and they were to celebrate, and it was the best wine. I'm not a wine connoisseur. I like wine. I enjoy going and tasting wine, and I don't know, but I think that one of the most interesting characters in this whole thing is this head waiter that was the first person on this planet to put into his mouth what I believe was the greatest wine that was ever on this planet. He would have a different palate the rest of his life. Probably never drink wine again after that. It'd be a letdown. God makes extraordinary things. The very best wine. Here's how the story closes out. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. By the way, this is where Epiphany comes in. This is the light bulb turned on, the breaking of the dawn. This is what it says specifically as the result of this light. And his disciples believed in him. In fact, the Greek word is believed into him. It's kind of interesting because that's not really a very normal English phrase, but John always uses it. He never says believe in Jesus. He always says believe into him. They put their trust in him, a lot of translations will say. After this, it says he went to Capernaum with his mother and brothers, his whole family and disciples, and they stayed there a few days. Well, so what? How does it relate to us? How do we celebrate Epiphany, and why does it matter? The first thing I want to point out is this idea of believing into, putting your trust in something. Because one of the most interesting things to me, the church celebrates this story as the moment of epiphany for Jesus' best friends. It was this story where they said, okay, they've already been called, and now they're saying, now, John says, now they put their trust in him. But previously, in John chapter 1, it's very clear that they already believed into him. So what's John trying to say? Is John trying to say that Christianity is more than just saying some sinner's prayer at some point in your life and then just cruising the rest of your life? Possibly. See, his understanding of trust and believing into is that it is ongoing. It is present tense. You put your trust into someone and you do it again and again. I think of my own life when I was falling in love with Marka. I had met her. I guess it's kind of, at the time I first met her, we were just kind of talking. There was two girls that I was interested in at the University of Texas. There was one and her. It was great because there was a quarterback controversy at the University of Texas at the same time, and it provided the perfect analogy for me to figure out which girl I needed to choose in my life. So anyway, I was trying to figure that all out. But here's what happened. It wasn't long at all before Marka started to capture me in a way that really surprised me, and that was this. I trusted her, and she was a lot more beautiful, which helped too. But as I was progressing through this, I was thinking a lot about what trust is. And here's the thing I want you to hear about this process of falling in love with Marka. I found that instead of trying to impress her, I trusted that she could know the real me. And those of you that have fallen in love know what this experience is like. I just trusted her more and more with the dark side of who I was and the messed up self. And I knew that because of who she was, I could trust her. Why do I share that? Trust has very little to do with us. And has a lot more to do with the trustworthiness of the thing we put our trust in. It happened with these servants and these disciples. They didn't do anything extraordinary. They just stumbled across somebody who's fully trustworthy. They found in human form a divine God who's so filled with unconditional love that their boundaries constantly, over and over again, were torn down, and they could trust into him because he was trustworthy. Now, for some of you here, you may have never experienced any entrance point into trusting God. And there may be reasons for that. You might have scars and pains in your past that make that very difficult. But for those of you that are in that place, I would encourage you to keep seeking and putting yourself in a position to let this God woo you with his unconditional love. And don't focus on, are you good enough or do you have extraordinary faith? None of that matters. What matters is how trustworthy God is. And you will fall into that. And then for those of you that have put your faith in Christ and begun that journey. You know, I began a journey with Marco when we got married. That wasn't the ending point of putting my trust in her. We continually trust and grow. And the analogy breaks down because we're imperfect and make mistakes, but with God, He is perfect. And it's always just a forward-moving, more trust from more experience with Him. Second thing I want you to think about is a so what, or what matters. Think about that phrase from Mary. Do whatever He tells you to do. Now I want to be cautious here because our human nature, the side of us, the animal beast that tends to be drawn towards religious doing things and earning love, which has nothing to do, especially with John's gospel and his message, would say, okay, what do we have to do? What do I do to get to be with God? And the thing is, Mary's talking about trust too. She's saying, whatever it is that He says, trust Him. Do it. It's for you. God is still here. That's the shocking message of Christianity, is that this just isn't just ancient stories in a real physical location and place. It's still now. Mary is speaking to us, and God is speaking to us. He tells us things. The more you get to trust Him, the more you fall into this relationship, you learn more and more that He truly does want the best for you. I often use the phrase, He wants you to be the best version of yourself. Do what He says. Even if it's weird and crazy like this story, fall into the trust of God and figure out what He's calling you to do to be the best version of yourself. Here's the last piece of my favorite part of the whole story. I like the idea that ritual, dirty water gets turned into the very best. And the reason is because I think the central spiritual truth, John especially as a gospel writer, he wrote about physical, historical events, but he always wanted to make the point that there is a more real spiritual truth that takes place inside a human heart. And I think the message of this story, and that lines up with the whole thematic gospel of the 66-book library that is the Bible, is that dirty water that has nothing to offer can be transformed into something extraordinary and exuberant and life-bringing and satisfying. I think that's what this story is about. I think the reality is all of us have to say, is it possible that the message that John as an old man was sharing with that community is that he wants to take you and me, dirty, incapable, and unworthy, and do something absolutely extraordinary with your life? I mean, my temptation always to say, well, it couldn't be me. I'm too ordinary. And I'd say, perfect. You are officially available for God to do something absolutely extraordinary in your life if you are ordinary. He loves taking ordinary things and turning them into extraordinary. And I am speaking to you, every single one of you. God's desire, I know this is truth, God's desire is to take your life and to make it into something absolutely extraordinary. As we come to the communion table today, it's fitting that we celebrate with bread and wine. I think it's really cool. Augustine, he said something really beautiful. In the 4th century, he was commenting on this, and he said, you know what, I don't even think it's that great of a miracle. He said the reason is that the miracle isn't really a miracle because it happens every single day. He said, in a grape, water is turned into wine. And just like the servants, the clouds pour forth water, it goes through a vine, and the grape miraculously turns that water into wine. He said, but we lose the magnificence of it because of its constant redundance. That's what he said about that. I thought that's a beautiful line. We miss the miracle of a grape. We long to see water to wine, and it happens every day all around the world. That's true of so many miraculous things in the world around us. And as we come to the communion table today, I would offer the same question. Do we often, sometimes, in doing this, as often as we do it, which is, by the way, what Jesus had in mind when He said, do this as often as you partake, do we sometimes, because of its constant redundance, miss the miracle of this wine and this table and this bread? Because it is the gospel. And although it is beautifully redundant, it is still absolutely magnificent. That Christ's body was broken for us. That Christ's blood was spilled for us. The dirty water who offered nothing. He offered complete, unconditional love. And this physical picture is for us to take Christ in. We can put our faith into Him. This is communion, connection with each other and connection with God. So if you haven't been here before, we have 4 different places, and as the music plays, this is an open table. Anyone's welcome to the table of Jesus to remember and take seriously His body and blood. And it's an optional time. No one feel pressure. There's many reasons to abstain for this. Let me pray over these elements, and let's put our belief and trust into Jesus. God, I'm thankful for this story, God, that has literally echoed through centuries of time. been celebrated at this time of year so many years, so many billions of people that remember the idea that your light has broken into darkness, God, in Epiphany, that you're glorious, God. And that light is your loving forgiveness, your grace, the grace of your wine, the joy of your wine, that we can do nothing to earn, we can only receive. And so, God, at this communion table with these elements, God, we first of all ask you for forgiveness. God, collectively we come before you and we say, please forgive us, Father, for those things that we do, that hurt us, that hurt other people, that hurt you. And see us as you see your Son. See us white as snow and pure. And God, we accept that grace. And God, we also pray that we will experience the communion of your very real presence in this place. We know you're here. And I pray, God, that we not, through constant redundance, miss the bigness of your presence that never goes away. We love you and we give you this time. Please speak to us. It's kind of funny. I went back in the back and I had a text message from my wife. And she texted me and said, hey, just so you know, I think that happened at your friend Blake's wedding, not Chris's wedding. I was like, oh, and I'm sure you guys are like, oh, who cares whose wedding it was? Well, yeah, I mean, Blake lives in Wayside, Texas, no big deal. Well, Blake and his wife Donna are here visiting today. And unless they're offended and got up and left, they're out there. And I just want to say, Donna, I remember your wedding. It was beautiful. It was awesome. But now, what's the chances, right? One weekend. Here's the thing. The truth is, everything does go wrong in life. Wine runs out at weddings. Wine runs out in life. But here's the unique thing that we have as followers of Christ. We know who to go to. And so may we, as we leave here, and as wine runs out, whatever that situation looks like, may we go to the source, the one who's powerful enough to do something and the one that more importantly cares enough to do something. And let's do whatever he says. And so as we leave today, I want to encourage you to go be together. As always, the holiest moment, walking out those doors. Go be together and let's be people that are filled with exuberance and life and joy. We pray for you. God, thanks for today. Thanks for the gift of this community. I'm so thankful for this family. We pray for those that are not with us today, that are still gone for the holidays. And God, we just pray that we will somehow always turn to you. In your beautifully redundant presence, God, I pray that we will always turn to you and do what you say. And God, that we will be a light and a joy for this town. We love you. Thank you for your grace. In Jesus' name, amen.